You're listening to the Sass Says podcast. I'm your host, Christy Rocha, also known as Sass. I identify as a woman, a wife, and a mother. That should tell you a lot already. And over the last few years, I've learned the value of talk therapy. I have seen how my inner work not only enhances my own well-being, but also my marriage, my parenting, my relationships. And in fact, you wouldn't be hearing this right now if it weren't for the work I've done. My mission is to debunk the misconceptions and stigmas around what therapy is and who it's for. Let's normalize working on our mental health and seeking help when needed. We've all heard of self-care, self-help, and self-love, but do you often wonder how to actually make it all happen? I do. You'll hear strategy-based conversations with professionals, as well as inspiring and validating stories from women who are just like you and me. Think of this podcast as the weekly therapy sessions you didn't know you needed, with a dash of sass, a lot of vulnerability, and me, relentlessly asking, but how? Hello. All right, I've got Jessi Shuraleff on the show today. Jessi is a storyteller, podcast host, and passionate leader. Jessi spent 3.5 years at Google building and leading strong sales and marketing teams, working with some of the largest global brands in the world. Creating, building, and maintaining relationships is at the core of who she is, and authenticity, vulnerability, and storytelling have been the cornerstone of her skill set to get her where she is today as a leader, podcaster, and mom. Her passion is working with female leaders and women-led businesses, helping them develop their voice and amplify that voice in an authentic and proven way. Her mission is to create community and connection through sharing personal stories to empower individuals and brands to step into their own light, reclaim their voice, and drive greater impact. Boom. All right, so today we talk about the pivotal and life-changing moment Jessi had at 6:03 one morning. She'll get into it. We talk about looking inward and listening to your inner voice. We talk about tough, uncomfortable, but necessary conversations we sometimes need to have with ourselves and with our partners. Jessi shares a story of her infertility, which leads to a conversation on loss and grief. We talk about self-development and holding space for ourselves and for the women in our communities. This is a raw conversation, and I'm just going to say you might want to have a tissue or two handy. All right, here's Jessi. Hey, Jessi. Thank you so much for being here with me.
Christy, I'm so excited. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, of course. I have listened to your podcast for some time now and have consumed some of your other content, and you've got a lot that I want to get into. So I think I'm going to start with that moment in the morning and your husband asking you, are you happy? And actually what I want to ask about it is, what did he mean by the question? Like, what was happening that even led him to ask you, are you happy?
It's such a good question. So honestly, even you talking about that moment, it always brings me back, and I get like full body goosebumps. So just for people who are not familiar with the moment that you're talking about, there was a moment that I had several years ago. It was 6:03 in the morning, and I'm holding my electric toothbrush, and our bathroom at the time had double vanity sink. And so I'm standing at my sink, my husband's standing at the other sink, and he just happens to glance over at me and ask me a question that he's probably asked us like countless times in our relationship, and ask me, are you happy? And I remember pausing and like glancing at the clock to sort of like buy myself time. That's why I know it was 6:03 in the morning, and I'm not a morning person. And just this like vehement no comes like blurting out of my mouth. And it scared him and it scared me. And I realized in that moment I had a choice. I could choose to sort of backpedal and make a joke of it and say like, haha, just kidding. Or I could own, probably for the first time in my adult life, that was truly how I felt, that despite on the outside anyone looking into my life would think that I had this perfect life. I had two little humans, a house in the city of Chicago, an amazing job as a sales leader at Google. Yet I was numb inside. And, to go back to your original question, what prompted him to ask that question? We've talked about that. And my husband is very empathic and is very attuned to my emotions before I'm attuned to my emotions. And it drives me insane. We've had numerous conversations about it in couples therapy. And I think, him asking me that used to be a trigger of mine. And it still is to an extent, but now I understand where he's coming from. And I think that, him asking me that question this morning, he was definitely not expecting the answer that I gave him. I wasn't expecting to give that answer, but I'm so grateful that I did. And I'm so grateful that he had the foresight to ask, even though he wasn't anticipating that answer. And even though it made, the next few months and years difficult as I was trying to figure out who I was again.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure even as a partner, his first thought was probably, what did I do, or what am I not doing, or like
Yes.
like personalizing it, taking it personally. And did you, when you said no, did you mean for him to take it that way? Like, what was going through your head? Like, you had the impulsive no that just came out, but can you pinpoint for yourself even what led to that point?
I've thought about this a lot, and you're right. Him and I have talked about that. Like, in his mind, from the conversations that him and I had, right, he internalized that. He was like, oh my goodness, what have I done? What's wrong with our relationship? What role did I play in that? And if I'm really honest, if I think about myself, if I put myself back in those shoes, I think I sort of felt a sense of relief, if I'm really honest. In that, like I said earlier, like, for the first time in my adult life, I think I was brutally honest with myself and let myself actually express that. And, the way that I grew up, I come from a very loving, close-knit family, but we didn't do emotions. And so I think that played a large part. There was I prided myself in never crying. I prided myself in crying once every few years. And so I think there was just a sense of relief, but then also a sense of shock of oh my gosh, what did I just do? Like, I ripped open Pandora's box in a way.
Yeah. I mean, I asked the question in that way because, in reading that about your story and hearing you talk about it, it of course begs one to ask themselves, am I happy? And I can imagine asking my partner that, or having him ask me, asking myself, and to say no, it then automatically begs, well, then why? Like, what is it that you're not happy with? And I think that it can be really hard in a partnership or in a marriage to have to explain how almost like two things can be true. I can love you with every fiber of my being and still be unhappy with potentially the way, our day to day goes. Or, I'm thinking in my house, it's like the dishwasher is full. Like, I don't know, just like things that we sort of bicker about. And it can be really tricky, I think, to sort of explain yourself in that environment when you're looking at someone that you do love so much, but something's not right. Something's not feeling right.
100%. And if I'm honest, at that point in my life, I don't even think I had the words to effectively have that conversation with him. It took me a long time to sort of unpack a lot of the stuff that I'd been shoving down. It took us starting couples therapy and like learning how to recommunicate with each other. And, when you're talking about that, being able to sort of hold those two truths, right, of loving someone so much, yet still not being satisfied with sort of how things are, it brought me back to a moment. And I recently talked about this on my blog, where it was in the middle of the pandemic. And again, I'll never forget this. I'm cooking eggs for the girls. I make them eggs every morning for some reason. and, and I can literally like feel my husband's frustration like rolling off of him, and I am silently crying, and in my head I'm just thinking like, not this, not this, not this. I don't want this marriage. And I remember putting the eggs down and like pulling on my big girl pants metaphorically and asking him to take a walk. And in this walk, we're sort of like bungling through our couples therapy like techniques. And I remember thinking in my head, I need to tell him I'm unhappy in the way things are with our marriage, but I know that it's going to be triggering his biggest fear. But I knew I also needed to say something in order to speak my mind. And so where we were living in Chicago at the time, there was a church nearby and it had this little garden. And I will never forget sitting in the garden with like our Australian shepherd, like between us, and just looking at him and saying, I need you to hear this. I love you. I want you, but I no longer want this marriage. And again, it was another one of those moments where I was sort of surprised with myself of saying it, but proud of myself too, because me 5 years ago, I never would have said that. I would have just shoved it down. I would have become resentful. I would have become angry. I would have become more withdrawn and more unhappy and not even had realized it. And so even in that moment, while I loved him dearly, I had to accept the fact that I needed to say my piece. And I also needed to be okay with what was going to happen. Like I couldn't go into that conversation, wanting to change him. Even though, that might help our marriage. And so it was just really, I don't know, when you said that, that's sort of what came out for me, was like, there are so many moments that I can point to where I've held like two opposing emotions, I guess you will. And for me, I think having the courage, I've learned to have the courage to, use my voice and speak my truth, and also be okay with whatever the outcome might be.
Yeah. Yeah. And I do eventually want to get to how you did all of that, but I want to press you again on the leading up point, and just, things that I was jotting down as you're talking is, hearing the not this, not this, not this, I don't want this marriage. It's obvious, but I'm going to say it anyway. It's like there's love, and then there's this human being, and then the marriage is like this whole other entity. The marriage, to me, when I hear you say that, it incorporates finances, parenting, like scheduling. It's like that. It's that stuff. It's like that's the hard stuff. It's the loving the person part, actually, that's can be just pretty natural, right? It's the marriage, the work, and it's funny, I told you off air that I had a conversation with Heather Chauvin recently, and I don't know if you know this, you might, because I know you work with her, but in her book trailer video, she talks about women constantly having that whisper of not this, not this, not this. And hearing her say it, hearing you say it, like it sends like shivers up my back because I think there's so much there. As women, like we're taught to push it down and be the good girl and be, just accepting and go with the flow. But the other thing that Heather helped me connect, and it's reminding me so much of everything you're saying, is, I don't want to gloss over, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, that you potentially for years pushing down your feelings of not this when it came to whatever the dynamics were of your marriage. It wasn't like, well, I'm going to speak for you for a second, then you can correct me, but it's not like you're sitting there with this, this person on the other side of you going, don't tell me what you think. Don't tell me. It's like you were just as afraid for yourself to say it out loud. It's like, and I say that only because I can imagine times in my life where I've been there, and it's like, it's just as scary to admit it to myself that it's not this, not this, not this, like you said it differently, and we're saying the same thing now that I'm really thinking about it, but like being prepared for whatever outcome came from saying that.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to underscore, I think one of the hardest things you can do is, or at least I can only speak for myself, but one of the hardest things that I had to do was look inward and admit to myself that I wasn't happy. Admit to myself that at that point in our relationship and in our marriage, I didn't want what it currently looked like.
Yeah.
And I think so often as women,
it's terrifying.
It's terrifying. And I think that, I was thinking about this. I was recently rereading Lean In by Sheryl Sandberg and then Lean Out by a former teammate at Google, Marissa, who left Google prior to me. And what struck me in sort of that was missing in both the books was this notion of, Lean In is all about leaning in and like getting to the table.
Yeah.
And Lean Out is like, we don't all want to be leaders. We don't all want to have a seat at the table. But I think what was missing for me in both those point of views was, are we even freaking asking ourselves what we want?
Yeah.
Right? Like, are we taking the time to actually ask ourselves that question to ourselves? And I think the answer for me, I know the answer for me for the longest time was I was avoiding that question. I didn't want to ask myself that question. I didn't want to have the honest conversation with myself. And so for me, I think that was the scariest part.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So you've mentioned couples therapy. Like, was that the very next step, or how did you on your own? And I am curious about couples counseling because I have not talked to anyone directly who's done it. So I'm curious how that went and how it works for you guys now. But, what happened next?
Yeah. So that 603 moment, in that moment realized I needed help. And so I actually went back to seeing a therapist myself. I had seen a therapist while I was going through infertility treatments, and then I got pregnant with my first pregnancy, and I stopped going. It was probably a bad decision. And so I stopped, and then I had this 603 moment, and I realized I needed help again. So I started seeing a new therapist this time. And I also then found a coaching program, which ironically was Heather's coaching program. And so for your listeners, it's Heather Chauvin's coaching program. And it was really eye-opening for me. It was hard and amazing and scary. But for me, one of the biggest things that I had shoved down was my journey to becoming a mom. And I won't go into the whole story right now, but I went through years of infertility treatments and eventually finally became pregnant, and I was pregnant with twins. And it was amazing and scary and all the things. And then we found out that our son was really sick. And we ultimately had to make a decision, and we had to make really tough decisions. And like even now I get chills like thinking about it. And ultimately had to make a decision that would save my life and save the life of my oldest daughter. And as we were going through that process and that journey, I had just shoved all of those feelings and emotions. I never dealt with it. In fact, after several weeks of medical appointments and procedures, I was on a plane 2 days later for work, and I just buried it all. And so one of the biggest things that I learned through the coaching program and through going back to therapy was I really had to unpack a lot of that. I had to, again, look inward and ask myself the really hard questions and forgive myself in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And so in doing so, I started to share my story. And yes, I started to share it more publicly, but just to circle back to sort of your original point was I had to start to share it with myself first.
Yeah.
And I had to accept it and really have it become a part of me versus something that I just, I used to say that I would compartmentalize, I would shove things down, I would lock it up in a box and I throw away the key. Well, that was not healthy, which I realized. And so it was in sharing my story where I realized that so many of us have moments where we felt alone or isolated. And so many women told me too. And it wasn't that they all had experienced infertility or they had all gone through, a loss of a pregnancy. But for those women who hadn't, they still said me too, because they could still relate to my story. And that was sort of my aha.
Yeah. What do you, I mean, I get the chills hearing you talk about it. And the only reason I'm not crying is because I've heard you talk about it before. And so I've had that moment where I can't begin to fathom what that moment was like when you had to make that level of a decision. I mean, I don't even know what else to say about it. I'm almost speechless about it because I can imagine just how painful and all the things. I don't even have articulate words for it. And how did you get through that? Like how I don't know. I don't know. I just I guess okay. How do you cope with it now? Now that you've done a lot of the work, like how do you think about it? I'm sure you think about it all the time. So when thoughts come up, when feelings come up, what do you do? How do you cope?
Yeah, I think that's a great question because, to answer sort of the unasked questions, like how did I deal with it then? I didn't deal with it.
Right.
And it wasn't healthy. And so how do I deal with it now? So now I talk about it. I always butcher sort of like the actual quote from Brene Brown, but right, like shame comes when we don't talk about it. And so now I talk about it. When I'm thinking about Clark, I'll talk to Lucy, who's my oldest daughter, her twin brother. So Clark is our son. And I talk about it. Lucy knows that she has a brother. Quinn, my youngest, knows that she has a brother. I mean, to the extent that a 5.5-year-old and a 3.5-year-old like can understand that.
Right.
And, when people ask me, how many kids I have, I'm pretty, not in all situations. I make the choice sort of depending on the mood I'm in and where I am. But I'll tell people that, my oldest daughter was a twin and our son is no longer with us. And it's interesting to sort of see people's reactions to that. And so I think the way that I cope with it now is I've made it part of my narrative. It always was part of my narrative.
Yeah.
but I wasn't ready to accept it. I wasn't ready to actually own that part of my story. And what I realized in sort of going through therapy and coaching was that when I wasn't owning that part of my story, someone else was telling the story for me. Right? I just, like, Clark didn't exist. No one in my family talked about him. It was, we basically had erased him. And I'm going to start crying now.
I know, I am too.
That's actually what gets me now thinking about sort of that time in my life, because I don't want, now I would never want to erase him. Right. Then I sort of had to shove it down in order to put one foot in front of another. Yeah. But now I'm at a point where I'm stronger and able to reclaim sort of that part of my story. And so things like I write him letters, I talk to him. A very close friend, as we were going through everything in Chicago, had given me, the day that we lost him, a butterfly necklace. She had worked at Children's Hospital in Chicago, but they had like a butterfly wall for in their NICU for patients that were lost. And so butterflies are a symbol of Clark, and everyone in my family knows that. And so the girls know that, I love butterflies. And if we see a butterfly, they'll say, like, look, Mom, Clark's coming to visit. And so it's a very long-winded way to answer, like, how I cope now is we've made him a part of our family.
Yeah. No, it's beautiful. I absolutely love that the girls know who Clark is. I think that is so, it's just beautiful because, like you said, he's your son. And so, of course, he's their brother. I think that's beautiful. And thank you so much for sharing in such detail. I know it's not easy to talk about, and I just really appreciate it. If, those of us who have not experienced infertility or the loss of a child, what do you wish more people understood about whatever, like, about your experience? What's misunderstood, or what do you wish more people knew and understood about the experience of women who, I guess even men too, who go through this?
So I think on the male side, I think as difficult, so the statistics are 1 in 8 couples struggle to conceive. And that's a lot of people.
It is, yeah.
And so as difficult as it is, I think, for women to talk about it, it's even worse for men. And I think about the support that I had. My husband had none.
Yeah.
And so I think, what this journey has taught me is really, you only see, right, the iceberg analogy, you only see the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to a story. And it's made me a much more empathetic leader. It's made me a much more empathetic parent. It's made me a much more empathetic human. And so I think that if there's one thing to take away from my experience, or what I wish people knew, is I never thought anyone was, what is the word I'm looking for? Being malicious. But so often, right, in our culture, it's so common, you get married and then it's like, when are you going to have a baby? And so I think it's just being conscious of everybody's stories are different. I don't ask people now, if they, like, if they have a family, like I sort of wait for people to bring it up, versus really trying to, like, probe. And again, like, I never really thought people were being malicious in it, or saying, like, what will happen, or just give it a few more,
right.
They just don't know. And so I think I've taken now to just using it as an education piece, and just reminding people that you have no idea what's going on under the surface.
Yeah, no, it's so true. And thank you for saying that, because yeah, it's just, what we do, right? We meet someone, oh, what do you do? Do you have kids? It's like, just, there's so much more to a person that we could ask about. And I don't know. I'd like to think we're moving away from those sort of standard, you know, I don't know, because who even cares anymore? I don't know. I don't know. I appreciate you saying that, because I think it just gives us all something to think about. And if someone wants to talk about it, they will, right? And all right, so I want to ask you one more thing about all of this, and then I want to get to, you know, sort of finding your voice and your ambitions and all that you've done with your podcast and your community. And I ask this somewhat selfishly because we're in a similar sphere of the world here. How does your husband and your family feel about you being as vocal as you are and as vulnerable and honest as you are about what goes on in your life?
Oh, Christy, it's $1 million question. You know, it's interesting because I do a lot of speaking events, and people often ask me, you know, how can you share your story in a way that doesn't impact people around you? And
yeah. Yes,
so
I want to know.
I'll be about this a lot. So first and foremost, I have certain boundaries about what I share and what I don't share. And those are boundaries that I've created for me. So one of my boundaries is I never share something that I haven't worked through myself. So I have lots of moments in my life where I felt alone and isolated. You know, like I said, infertility and, you know, the loss of Clark was one of those. I've worked through that, and actually sharing my story has helped me work through that. But there are other moments in my life that I'm still actively working through and I'm not comfortable sharing. And so that's like my first rule is like, you know, have I worked through it? The second question I always ask myself is like, what is my intention of sharing the story? Am I sharing it just for like the wow factor? Am I sharing it to like get a reaction out of somebody? Or am I sharing it from a place of genuine curiosity or genuine compassion and genuine like authenticity? If it's yes to the first two questions, I won't share. If it's coming from a place of, you know, a genuine place, that feels comfortable for me. And it's funny because I've actually, you know, has become a boundary for me from making mistakes. And we so often don't talk about mistakes, so I'll talk about mine. You know, like I'll look at like my blog posts, or I'll look at like Instagram posts where I'm sharing something, and I know as I'm doing it, I'm sharing it to see like to get likes or a reaction, and then they always fall short. And I'm like, oh yeah, good reminder. And then the other piece is, you know, so often, you know, obviously I shared that story about my husband and I in the garden, right? And so often other parts of my story, other people are involved. And the reality is even though other people are part of that story, it's still my story, right? It's my version, and I'm sharing my perspective. Never when I'm sharing my stories am I putting thoughts or projections onto my husband or a family member. And so again, it goes back to sort of what we were talking about earlier of like, really when I'm putting something out there, it's with the understanding that the other person's reaction is their reaction. And, you know, it's funny, like my husband and I've had this conversation before because I'm like, am I like sharing too much? And he has said, so like, for example, that story about the church courtyard, I wrote about it and I said to him, hey, I'm thinking about sharing this. Would you be comfortable if I share it? And he was like, of course. And I was like, really? Like, are you sure? And he was like, I completely trust you. And so he didn't have to say that to me. And so there are certain stories that I will sort of like check in with people on just to make sure they're okay with. But for the most part, if I'm sort of following rule, like my boundary, like my first two boundaries, I'm pretty comfortable sharing.
Yeah, no, those are great rules of thumb, and I do appreciate you sharing that it came from mistakes because I think especially as two people with podcasts, it's like you and I sit down, I have a headset on and I'm in front of a mic and we're doing this over a computer, but you and I are just two women talking in my mind a lot of the time. So, you know, I often have to, and I sometimes call myself out if I'm hesitating. I'll say, I'm hesitating because I'm deciding how much I want to share,
Yep.
and it's because you get in a flow with someone and you get a connection with someone, and it's you're two women and you want to talk and you want to share and you want to relate and you're bonding, and I do have to remember that this is going to be published and air and it's
Yeah.
going to live there forever. So it can be a little tricky.
100%. I'm curious what does your boundaries look like? Like, how do you decide?
Anything about me personally, like, so I do a lot of like body image work and about how I got to this point with the podcast and my ambitions and things like that. Like all of that in my mind is like free game. Like that has to do with my body and my mind and there. And I'll be honest with you, I have not talked a lot, and maybe he would tell me differently, but I just don't think that I've really talked much about my relationship to the point where I've been concerned. I'll tell you that the first time I was ever concerned was that I essentially like called him old. And I was like so nervous. It was my first interview. And I like warned him. I was like, I said you were part of a different generation and the implication is that you're old and oh my God. But I haven't fully worked it out is the point. Because I have that quote, I think it's Einstein, like, if you can't explain it to me, you don't understand it fully. And I'm having that moment now of like, I can't tell you exactly what it is. I lean more on things that I absolutely know are mine to share. And I haven't really crossed the other bridge yet.
Well, and I think the other point that I'm sort of like pulling out from what you're saying too is like it's an evolving process, right? Sort of as you, like I was saying, right? Like as I've made mistakes, I've sort of realized where my own boundaries are.
Yeah.
I often share a lot about my daughters, and my oldest has sensory processing disorder and ADHD. And I was just telling my husband the other day, I was like, she's coming of an age where she can give me consent. And so I might stop sharing as much about,
right.
I'll share my experience as being a parent with a child with neurodiverse needs. I can share experiences that I've had advocating for her, but I won't share her, my perception of her stories. Not
right.
that my perception of her stories is what I'm sharing, but like I won't share without her permission. Probably like soon. She turns 6 in 2 months, which is
she's
nuts.
getting right there. I have a niece who's I think 6, 7. I'm blanking at the moment, but she could fully give consent or not, So I get it. I get it. It's tough. Even putting them on social media and things like that. It crosses my mind. I haven't drawn any hard lines, but like I think, like you said, I think it just becomes something that you think about. Like you're not necessarily getting on there and being like, well, Lucy feels X, right? But in sharing just aspects of her life, it makes you think. It's tough.
Yeah. And I mean, I 100%. And I think for me, I think about it as an evolution. And I often say like nothing is permanent. And so, except, stuff will live. Like once it hits publish, it does live on. And then I'll learn, right? And so I think that has been my experience. My mom has told me she doesn't listen to the podcast because it'll make her too uncomfortable, which given how I was saying how my family doesn't do emotions, like does not surprise me. And like, and that's fine. I'm not offended by it. I'm not surprised by it. That's her decision. I guess where I'm going with this is like we all have our own boundaries, and what my decisions are will be different from yours. And I think just respecting that and understanding that we all are making our own decisions as best we can.
Yeah.
And that's okay.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So this is my truth podcast. How did you go from Google, exec, corporate America to I'm going to do a podcast?
Well, it's important to note that I started my podcast while I was still at Google.
Okay.
So I launched my podcast in March 2020. What a terrible time to launch a podcast, right? In fact, like the first few episodes I had pre-recorded before the pandemic hit. And I had to like jump back on and be like, so by the way, these were all pre-recorded. The world has not fallen apart yet. But it was important to me to launch. So I launched on March 31st, 2020. And it was really important to me to launch on that date because it was my daughter's 4th birthday. And so it just, then the pandemic hit and the world turns upside down. And we were hit pretty hard with the pandemic in the sense that we were living away from family. Our nanny couldn't come in with the stay-at-home orders. My father-in-law had a stroke. My parents had COVID. And it just like everything around me felt like it was falling apart. Not only did my daughter's preschool close because of the pandemic, it financially closed.
Oh, no.
So it just was like, it literally felt like everything around us was falling apart. And like many of us during the pandemic, it started to help me put things in perspective. And all the while I was doing the podcast and loving meeting amazing people like you and all the other amazing guests that I've had on. And it just sort of hit me right like that, not this. And I often say that I'm not really great at listening to my not this. Like it like starts as a whisper and then it becomes like a talk and then it becomes like shout. And it's like usually when it becomes a shout that I'm like, oh yes, like I will listen. So there was this moment, not this moment that I was sort of like, oh, it's time for me to probably like listen, it was September 2020. Pandemic still going strong in the city of Chicago. And we decided to put my oldest into like a homeschooling pod situation. I was working part-time. I was supposed to be working part-time. And that didn't really happen. And so a meeting got scheduled during the time that I had off. And it was during pickup time for my oldest daughter's school. So I had my youngest in the car with me and I was like, okay, no big deal. I'm going to just drive over there. I'll take this conference call that was scheduled with, several VPs, and I'll get off the call and then I'll go pick Lucy up from school. No big deal.
Yeah. Easy peasy.
Right? Like working mom for the win. I was like patting myself on the back.
My stomach is in a knot just hearing you talk about it.
And so, I'm sure you can imagine where this is going, right? So I parked the car and I log into the call. And as soon as I do that, Quinn, my youngest, goes, Mom, I've got to go potty. And we're in the city of Chicago, like nothing is open at this point. Felt like I could like pop into a Starbucks and take her to the bathroom. And honestly, I was also, my anxiety about COVID was off the chart. So I wouldn't even like considered that if there was one open. But
without COVID, all of that, even if you could have taken her into a Starbucks, she's still a toddler having to be taken into a Starbucks to go to the bathroom. Like that in itself is anxiety.
And so I'm on this call and, trying to like help my team lead it. And Quinn has decided to like go into like epic meltdown because I don't have her travel potty in the car. Of course not.
Of course.
And so the only thing that I had in the car was a reusable like Whole Foods bag. Now it was one of those like ones that you could put like freezer stuff in. So it was like slightly more padded.
Oh my God.
And so I'm like, Quinn, I'm sorry. Like, you're going to have to go to the bathroom in this. And she's losing her mind. Like, it's not,
Yeah.
that,
Oh, I
that
know.
like complete. So I am negotiating with a then 2.5-year-old to pee in this reusable Whole Foods. I think about it. I'm like, oh my goodness. So it's a reusable Whole Foods bag or to pee on me. Like those were her two options.
Just another day.
While also still trying to be on this call to go through 2021 planning with these VPs.
Oh my God.
And I just remember, I mean, this was like, so Quinn pees in the bag, the pee goes all over the place. I'm like, I hang up the call. I get Lucy from school, and I remember coming home and I looked at Greg and I was like, I can't do this anymore. Like something has to change. Yeah. And so, it wasn't like we made the decision overnight. It was, I think for a long time I'd been feeling the pull to leave corporate. And I think the pandemic probably accelerated a decision that I would have made eventually. The podcast helped because I was getting so much joy from it. And over the course of several months, we had lots of conversations, lots of arguments about it. And ultimately we made the decision that I would take the leap of faith and I would quit my job. And I was there for 13.5 years.
Wow.
And take a break and just sort of take a pause and see what felt like the right next move for me, for us, for our family. And that's where we are right now.
Any mother who has toddlers or who had them at one point can put themselves in a situation that you were in. I mean, just the vividness of the details, like it is so spot on to just the absolute insane chaos that toddlers are, but also just like the expectation of parents to be in that situation is just mind-boggling to me. And the other thing I jotted down as you were talking is, like the not this of the whisper to the talk to the shout. I mean, I feel like I let the not this get to the point where it's so tired from shouting that it's crying. And it's like, because I get to the point of I can't even say I can't do this anymore. Like I'm so past the point, and I'm working on it. But you're not alone, and I just want to say you're not alone in that. It is so hard, it feels like that little tap on the shoulder, and like there's so many different, I guess, metaphors or whatever we could put to it, but it's like a tap on his shoulder to like a punch in the face, just like not this, woman, not this. So the podcast and like where is it going for you? Like where do you see your community going? Where do you see your podcast, your brand? Like what is your vision for all of what you're doing?
Yeah. So my vision is I love working with women who are ready to reclaim their voice. And what I mean by that is there is always a part of me that felt like there was something else. When I first met my husband, 14 years ago, I remember saying to him, one day I'm going to start my own business, but I had no idea actually what that meant. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is like, if you've ever had that little fire like burning inside of you, or that little voice sort of saying there's something else out there, or I am really proud of the success that I had in corporate America. But I still did not necessarily feel satisfied by that. I wanted more, but I didn't know what more was. And so for me, it took sort of that 603 moment to recognize I had lost my voice. I had lost sort of who I was, and I was living for everybody else, but no longer living for myself. And I think in having so many conversations with women, especially women in corporate America, that's such a relatable narrative. Mm-hmm. And I get it, and yet it still breaks my heart. Mm-hmm. And so now I work with women, mainly who are in corporate America, but not necessarily, who are looking to get to that next point where they are looking to own their stories and speak their truth, both at work and in life, and do so in a way that feels confident and authentic to them. Mm-hmm. And so I do that through my community. I do that through one-on-one coaching. I do that through speaking and workshop events. And I have a program that I call, or part of my community that I call Truth Seekers, but it's really about creating a space for women to really work through those moments where they felt alone or isolated, and, you know, work through them either through writing or just, again, giving yourself that space to like ask those questions internally, and then share those moments in a really safe environment with other like-minded women. And it's just this like magical, empowering thing. I always leave the sessions with like a huge goofy smile on my face. And my husband's like, oh, like you were just like a truth seeker. And I was like, yep. And I just think there's such magic, or my experience has been there's such magic when you are able to create space for women to feel seen, heard, and validated. Mm-hmm. It's such an empowering experience.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. Within the coaching, within the workshops, you know, give someone an idea who's like never worked with a coach, who has no idea what we're talking about in a really tangible, you know, what's one example of like an exercise or a session that you would have? Like, what does it look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I have this framework that I use actually to work through some of my own moments. And it's really about putting yourself back in that moment. So I ask people to sort of like think about a moment that sticks out to them. So a moment, you're probably like, what is a moment? A moment is, you know, a memory that you just cannot get out of your head. It could have been something that happened 5 seconds ago or something that happened 25 years ago, but it's stuck with you, and it's stuck with you for a reason. And you most likely haven't worked through that reason yet. And so I ask women to sort of think about one of those moments. And usually I'll give a prompt, a moment around like parenthood or a point in their career, and then ask them to put themselves back into that moment and really think about it, and ask like where in their body are they feeling it, like what is happening in that moment, and what do they need in that moment. And then once they sort of grounded themselves in that, I have a writing framework that I ask them to use where they really write about the moment. So the first part of it is like you're painting the picture of the moment for yourself, right? Mm-hmm. The next sort of piece is of the framework is you're asking yourself, you know, what are you reflecting about that moment? And then the last piece is about, you know, what are you taking away, or what can someone else take away from that moment? So if we use that 603 moment that I talked about in the beginning, right? That framework applies is like, I paint the picture of the 603 moment. Like you all could hopefully see me standing there with, you know, my toothbrush. Mm-hmm. And then, you know, my reflection is, oh my goodness, I've lost my voice and I didn't even realize it. And then the takeaway is like, that was the moment where I decided I was going to reclaim my voice and do everything I could in my power to reclaim my voice so that I could be the mom, the human, the partner that I knew I was, and that I wanted to be again. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Did that help answer your question?
Oh yeah, totally. I think, you know, I one of my, you know, goals or mission is is to encourage people to seek help. And typically that's my message is through therapy, but therapy is not necessarily for everyone, or maybe they're not ready for it, or maybe they're already doing it. And so I try to help people understand what working with certain individuals will look like so they can start to sort of figure out, oh, could that be an option for me? And so yes, thank you. And I think, I also try to, and I think I even said this in talking to you last time we were doing this, is just trying to put myself back in the shoes of someone who hasn't been to therapy and who hasn't interviewed countless coaches and people who've done the self-development work, because before you do it, it's really hard to imagine what it's going to be like. And it can seem very intimidating and overwhelming. And so I appreciate you taking the time to do that, because it helps people see that it really starts with very small steps.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Anything else you want to say on that?
No, I was going to say, I've actually thought about our conversation a lot after the fact. Mm-hmm. And I think, the first time someone said to me, like, where do you feel that in your body? And I was like, excuse you?
Right, exactly.
Exactly.
Yes.
Excuse you, like, what? And as someone who, had spent the better part of, 20 plus years, like shoving emotions down, like to be like, well, where do you feel that in your body? I was like, I don't even know where to begin with that. And so
yeah.
I think, for me, it's about meeting people where they're at. I've had so many conversations with friends and family, and they're, people are always like, oh my gosh, like, it's so amazing how open you are. But the reality is like, I wasn't always this open.
Right.
And so I think, like, I always try to, similar to what we talked about when you and I talked last, right? Like, it's okay. Like, if you're not ready to share your story, mm-hmm. I get it. I completely get it. And the sharing of the story actually starts with sharing it with yourself first. Mm-hmm. Like, before you can start to share with one other person or 10 other people or 50 other people, like, you have to start with yourself first. And, to come full circle back to how we started the conversation, sometimes that's the scariest step to take. Mm-hmm. And I get it. And I've been there, and I can completely relate to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I would argue that it's probably the scariest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, because we like to kid ourselves, and we like to put it on other people because it's easier. And and I think too, and this is getting this, I'll say this one thing before it goes down another tangent, but this is from Heather too. Heather we should just pay her for this, right? But she said something to me that I'm still thinking about, and that is that there is a fear that in our growth that we'll lose the people around us. And I think that that's so true. And it's almost like we have to also face that we'll lose a version of ourselves that once was. Like, you spent the better part of your life not facing your feelings and not dealing with them and talking about them and sharing them. And now that's a version of yourself that you really had to lose. And it's scary. It's who you were. It's who you identified as and were comfortable with. And it's scary. So, yeah, I don't.
Heather and I talk about this a lot, actually. And it's funny. I promise I won't take us down a crazy rabbit hole. But when I was on the call with her, right, like, where she's like ready to take my credit card information, like, the only question I had for her was like, what if I lose all my friends?
Yeah.
And so I think it's a real fear. And I think, what was really hard for me, right, when you're saying goodbye to sort of that version of yourself, mm-hmm. is I was really successful as that person.
Yes.
I did really well for myself.
Totally.
Shoving emotions down worked for me.
Yep.
And so it was and still is scary to think about that. And I often think about it as like a metamorphosis, maybe because I'm obsessed with butterflies, but you often have to go through those changes in order to become the best version of yourself, which is what I strive to do every day.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right. Boom. I think that is a wonderful way to tie a bow on this. Jessi, thank you so much for your time and your vulnerability. I just appreciate everything from the hard to the peeing in a bag. I mean, all of it. It's such a great conversation. Thank you so much.
Christy, thank you. I so appreciate it.
I get emotional every time I hear Jessi share one of her stories. She's so good at it. And as a person who puts content out into the world and shares some of the behind the scenes of my life, it always impresses me when someone does it as well and in such a profound and meaningful way as Jessi does. She makes it look easy, but I am telling you, what she just did is hard. I mean, really hard. To put your relationship, infertility, parenting, and all the challenges associated with each out there for public consumption, it's really a very vulnerable place to be. And Jessi and her platforms do this so well and in truly such an authentic way. When Jessi said, "I wanted more, but I didn't know what more was," did you relate? I did, like big time. And it's funny because every time I think I figure out what it is, what the more is, it changes, or I get that, and then I'm like, okay, now I want more again. And one of the things I'm really working on is trying to live and be more in the present, but I won't lie, it is hard, and sometimes I just don't like it. So anyway, I know I have a lot to learn from Jessi, so please check her out, and I'm excited to share that I will be on an upcoming episode of Jessi's podcast, so look out for that, and subscribe, rate, and review both of our shows wherever you listen to podcasts. It really helps us out so much. All right, thanks. Bye.
Thank you so much for tuning in today. Sass Says is a production of Luann Nigara, Inc. This podcast is meant to be educational and not meant to replace professional therapy or professional medical attention. To learn more about today's show and what's new in my world, head over to sasssays.com. Thanks so much. Talk later.